Now, the latest issue that the entire internet seems to have exploded over is Hassan Piker, noted Twitch streamer extraordinaire, noted famous socialist advocate online, has done the unthinkable. He has spent his money on a house. He has spent his own money on a thing that he wanted, which is apparently at counteracting the positions that he holds as a socialist. Because we all know socialism is when no house. You have to be a pauper if you're going to say you're a socialist, right? You can't have a socialist and own things. Otherwise, how would you be able to criticize capitalism if you were a person who owned things, right? So, I digress. I digress about this particular... I've been kind of jesting about this, right? So, the main issue people have is that, so the actual house that Hassan has bought in this incident is worth $2.7 million in West Hollywood, which is a lot of money. There's a lot more money than plenty of working people have in this country, or in the United States, or in most of the Anglosphere, right? This is a lot of money that he spent on a house. And people, the main criticism that we have, the people online have, is that if he is advocating for socialist policies and saying that the rich create a poor, the world is poorer to have more rich people, which he undoubtedly is one. He's a millionaire. He makes millions of dollars a year, right? Azan Pogo, true. It is then hypocritical of him to then advocate for socialist policies, not just social democratic policies, mind you, specifically socialist. He calls himself a democratic socialist by having the possessions that he has, or by buying a large, expensive house. He's had 4 bedrooms. So if he has all this money, he should be putting that to steal man other people's points. He should be, if he's got all of this money that he's essentially been paid for by regular people who subscribe to his Twitch channel, or the AdSense revenue that he's generated from YouTube. If he's made all this money advocating for socialism, instead of buying large, expensive things for himself, he should be putting this towards socialist causes to align more closely with his principles. So, that's the steal man of other people's argument. I think this argument is fucking stupid. Right. So there's many sides to this argument. The first of all is, how do we talk... Is $2.7 million a reasonable amount of money for a socialist to spend on a house? Second of all is, the money that Hassan has generated has to make him so rich. Is that something that we think is ethical for a socialist to be engaging in? And third of all, is it hypocritical of him to be that rich and make all that money? Is him just saying that we should tax the rich? Is he giving up his principles? Has his principles changed over time as he has gotten richer? I mean, he has a lot of influence by being Cenk Uyghur's nephew, right? He's got a lot of his platform is built off of the fact that he has, well-connected, rich family members. This is the platform that he has been built upon a media brand from the Young Turks. So there's plenty of understandable things why people would get upset about this particular purchase. Yes, of course, the same thing with Bernie Sanders being a successful author. So first of all, let us talk about the ethics of buying a $2.7 million house. Okay, so first of all, it was in West Hollywood. So you got to understand that $2.7 million for a house in West Hollywood is not the same as $2.7 million on a house in Fort Worth. Or, not even Fort Worth, they say a house in San Jose, or a house in Sacramento, or a house in Salt Lake City, or anywhere like that, right? It's not the same. This is one of the most expensive areas in the country, where his family lives already. Okay, so you could say, well, if it is expensive to spend that money, if we're taking it as read, that spending this much money on a house is bad, and if you want to buy a 5-bedroom house to live in, if you want to be beholden to your principles, you should buy that in a cheaper area, so that you're not being overzealous with your expenditure at the expense of contributing to socialist causes, right? Well, I think the just move argument is nonsense, as we've kind of dealt with Destiny going on about it all the fucking time when he's been debating about whether we think landlordism is a good thing or not. Say, well, you can't afford to live there, just move, right? The opposite is, well, you can afford to live here, but why are you spending all this money on this thing when you could just move? Which isn't a real argument. People have livelihoods, they have friend circles, they have family members in certain areas. It's not just, you can't, like, just upping and moving is not an easy thing to do. It's a very disruptive thing to do. So I don't think the idea that him spending the money on a house in West Hollywood is something that we can rail against him against, right? So, second point is 2.7 million on a house in general something that is defensible? Now, I would say to you, right, if Hassan Piker is going to buy a house, which not only is housing him, by the way, is housing him and his family as well. Right, so this is 5 people living in this house altogether, I believe. 4 or 5, right? What's better, materially, for working people in general who find it hard to buy houses, or even to rent in the United States, because the housing market is completely fucked, right? What's better, Hassan spending a lot of money buying an expensive house that already exists to house his whole family, or him going to a neighbourhood where the houses are cheaper, buying those houses, taking them off the market, to house these 2 people separately in more modest accommodation? I would argue that from a material level, it is better for him to buy the expensive house. He's not gentrifying anything. He's not paid for this house to be built. It exists already. He has the money to purchase it. He's bought it. And he's moved his family out of the small apartment they were in previously. Well, I guess not small, but the apartment they were in previously, they vacated that into something more affordable, something more in his price range because he's rich. So he's freeing up houses for people who aren't as rich as him by buying property that exists that is richer. So he's not making the housing market worse for working class people by buying this large property. So I believe, from my point of view on this issue, doesn't matter where he's living or how much he's spending on this house, and particularly, on how many people are living in his house, I think it's entirely defensible what he's done here. Okay. And so we get down to the argument, well, how can you call yourself a socialist when you spend this money on yourself, on a house, which is large and expensive and gaudy and it's got its own pool and 5 bedrooms, whatever. Like, people call it a mansion. I think it's probably on the cusp, right? Is that ethical for him to do so? Considering that he is a socialist, calls himself a democratic socialist, not a social democrat, right? I know he's made the argument, example, I believe that I should be taxed more because I'm rich, please tax me more. That is not a socialist argument, that is a social democratic argument. I mean, socialists will make the argument too, because socialists believe that taxing the rich people at the moment would be better than not, right? From a material benefit, from a consequentialist mindset, there being more tax on rich people will lead to better outcomes as far as socialists are concerned. But it's not a socialist argument, it is a social democrat, i.e. capitalist argument, that we can fix capitalism by taxing rich people more. So we believe we create a better world by there being more tax on rich people in a capitalist economy. That's a social democratic argument, in that you can fix capitalism with tax. So that's not an argument that Hassan can make whilst calling himself a socialist. Like, I agree that it's better if it is good for him to advocate for higher taxes on himself in this instance when he is so rich. But that's not in keeping with his idea as a socialist. But what is in keeping with his idea as a socialist is that socialism is not an ideology based around rich people being bad. It's an ideology that is based around the inherent exploitation of the capitalist mode of production, which is some person owning the means of production, and then people getting paid less than the value of their labour to create the commodities that then circle throughout the market, and everything that goes in with that, the profit motive, commodity fetishism, etc., that goes along with that. So, if we want to talk about saying, well, Hassan is rich, so he's bad, that's not a socialist argument. The socialist argument is, has he engaged in labour exploitation? Now, the way he has generated his revenue is essentially entirely through donations. You can all watch Hassan's Twitch stream, you can watch his YouTube videos for free if you want to. You do not have to give any money to Hassan to interact with his content. So he's not paywalling any of his content. It's not like the socialist argument against markets that Richard Wolff makes, where saying that when a commodity is scarce, capital markets have negative utility, because it means that people who are richer can pay for it and people who are poorer can't. So with that, the market and the profit motive lends itself so that when something is scarce, people who don't need it are more able to buy it. and also control the supply and create artificial scarcity in these regards. Like throughout, if the economy was planned, if you have a scarcity of milk in general, this goes to feed the children, because they are the people who need the most, rather than the people who can actually pay the most, which would be rich people making fucking whatever nonsense food they're going to make with milk, rather than it going to the people who need it the most, which is the poor people, right? That is a socialist argument, in that the way markets work through commodity production is exploitative through the capitalist mode of production, right? Someone who makes their entire living off of free content with donations is not engaging that same level of exploitation. He's made all his money in one of the most kind of least exploitative ways that you could do, by just saying, here's all my stuff, you can, if you want to give me money for it, you can, which is not exploitative in the slightest. So I don't think his being rich, I do not think is illegitimate in this particular regard. I would, as an aside, say though, he has a YouTube editor, he has Twitch mods, right? Under a socialist mode of production, Hasanabi enterprises, which conglomerates of him and the people who work for him, would not be a top-down Hassan decides who gets paid what. It will be democratically mandated, cooperatively, right? So all the editors would have to agree their own salary, without there being the implicit coercion of Hassan having individual control over this particular enterprise, over this particular firm that would be in this instance. So I do not know how much he pays his editors, but if you want to have a conversation about whether Hassan is engaging with his own socialist principles, just by saying he's rich, therefore he's not a socialist, is not a real fucking argument. What you actually have to talk about is the way he treats his employees and the way he runs his business. I would argue is probably capitalistically. I argue he has sole control over this particular firm that he runs. In essence, right? I don't think he's got a registered firm or anything, but he pays people's wages, he pays editors, and he pays mods. So we have to talk about the labour relation between those people. That is a socialist argument. Just saying he has a bunch of money, therefore he's not a socialist, that's not a real argument. So I don't think you can criticise him for being rich in this regard. And once he's made that money, he can spend it how he wants. Like, he's not gone through any kind of exploitation to do that, theoretically, depending on how he treats the people who work for him. I don't think the criticism that him being rich means he can't be a socialist, it doesn't make sense. It's nonsensical. He's not betraying his principles by making a load of money from Twitch. Do you see what I mean? The last part is, having made all this money, right, is it a net benefit for someone who says they're a socialist to spend that money on themselves? Now, I agree with a lot of the commentators on people who've been talking about this issue. I absolutely agree with them that he should do more to use his wealth and power to donate towards socialist causes, organisations, mutual aid organisations, organise a PAC. That was one thing Vorsh was talking about, was generating some kind of, using the incredible amounts of wealth that these large leftist content creators have, people like ContraPoints, people like Hassan, people like Vorsh, people like Second Thought, all these people who have loads and loads of capital at their disposal. It would be hypocritical of them to advocate their platforms for changing the system, and then not using their wealth to try and facilitate that moving forward. On his stream, Hassan did say that he does donate money, he does make political contributions, all that kind of thing, all those kind of things, but he doesn't have this outwardly facing, right? He doesn't use this as some kind of clout point to say, well, I donated XYZ amount to charity, which I get. It's one of those no-win situations where if you don't tell anybody you donate to charity, people say, well, you're just a person hoarding wealth, you're not donating to charity, that's bad. But if you do donate to charity, so always just virtue signalling and trying to gain clout by donating. So it really isn't a no-win situation. But if Hassan came out and said, well, I have so much money, I'm going to put together some kind of organisation, like Karl Kalinske did with Justice Democrats, right? He said, I'm making money off this platform. I have more money than I need to subsist and have nice possessions and all these things that I want. I have enough funding and capital left over to agitate for political change on a more kind of pragmatic level than just being a person on Twitch who spouts agitprop over at people, which is good. Like, if we want there to be people online spreading our ideas through agitprop on the internet, whether it be through YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, all these kind of platforms, we should be happy these people can make a living doing so, because that makes it easier for us to be able to spread our ideas further and to have more reach, because clearly these people have a big enough platform for there to be the reach and to be the market for it. However, that does not then mean that people who have all this money, which they've essentially gained through, with most people, through Patreon or through Twitch subscriptions, then they're not using that in an effective manner to be able to agitate for the political positions that they claim to hold, which is where I sympathise with the people who dislike Hasan in general. So yeah, in general, so basically my main takeaway from this argument is that what it has been is a bunch of sock dems moaning because they don't understand what socialists really advocate for. They think socialism is when no iPhone. Like, no, you can spend money on an iPhone. Like, but as if some kind of socialism is some kind of world where no one has nice things. We don't embrace the new technological advancement. Fucking the Soviet Union were the people to first send the first man into space and the first woman. Like, do you think they did that because they didn't value spending money on things that were going to create a better world for everybody, or, advancing technology, creating a world with nice things for people? Socialism is not when no fucking iPhone, which is just like a tier zero argument. And saying, well, if you advocate for tax on yourself and you're rich, then just makes you a sockdem rather than a socialist. And it's like, well, that just ignores the Marxist critique of the capitalist mode of production. Like, if there's anything conversation that we should have about this, it's not, does Hasan have a big house? Because I don't give a shit at the end of the day. It's, how effective is Hasan at pushing for socialism using the funds that he has, which is a good argument. And second of all, is a point that I was going to say and then I completely forgot about. I actually think that's the main point. The main thrust of my argument here is that, I remember what I was saying. So the first point is that we should talk about the way in which Hasan uses his money to be able to agitate for socialism in a more effective manner. How much more could he do? He's doing good work already. I don't think that we can say that. I don't think he's being hypocritical as such. But I do think the world would be a better place, and it would be morally better for him to take more of his money and put it into socialist projects moving forward. And second of all, we need to have a conversation about the kind of business that Hasan is running, how he treats his mods, how he treats his editors, and how much of a cut of the money that he makes do they actually get. Because then we can have a conversation about his own socialist ethics in that regard. Because him making money from Twitch and buying a house is not that. That's not a critique of his socialist positions. How he treats his workers and how he runs Hasanabi Productions, as it were, that is an actual conversation that we can have from a socialist point of view. And that would engender some kind of discussion about how true to his principles he really is. Because him getting money from Twitch and buying a house, that's not fucking it. Because it doesn't negatively impact the housing market for poor people. It doesn't, it's not, he's not, taking his ill-gotten gains and spending it on a mansion. Most socialists would contest that his gains are ill-gotten, because they're being funded by donations. So I just think it's a bunch of sock dems who don't understand the socialist point of view in this particular regard. So yeah, shut the fuck up, sock dems. Don't know what you're fucking talking about. So yeah.